head overseas to Ukraine, where the government authorities have given the military the green light to launch a major counteroffensive against pro-Russian forces. Should and will the U.S. boost its involvement in the crisis? We speak to a national security and political science expert on that very question. And New Jersey Governor Chris Christie was seemingly the GOP's #1 choice, on tap for the nation's top job. But is Bridgegate bringing the governor down? It seems more donors are throwing their support behind another presidential hopeful with the last name of Bush. Plus, a program that saves you money while giving prison inmates a college education, it gets a big boost. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French, and thank you so much for joining us this Friday evening, May 2nd. Tonight, we begin in Ukraine, where attacks from pro-Russian forces are growing more aggressive, and Ukraine is now fighting back. Pro-Russian insurgents suffered a significant loss today after Ukrainian soldiers launched a major counteroffensive. This after pro-Russian forces seized government buildings across the country's eastern region. Ukrainian government officials say the insurgents shot down 2 Ukrainian helicopters and 2 crew members were killed and dozens of others were injured. Today, the Ukrainian government launched its first offensive against those insurgents, as mentioned, and President Obama and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, they met at the White House, where they announced tougher sanctions will be imposed on Russia's economic sectors if, in fact, it does not de-escalate the crisis.
The goal is not to punish Russia. The goal is to give them an incentive to choose the better course.
At Russia's request, the UN Security Council is holding its 13th emergency meeting on the growing crisis in Ukraine. And we are now joined by Matthew Schmidt, Assistant Professor of National Security and Political Science at the University of New Haven. And he's been an expert throughout this process for us. And significantly, he'll be leaving shortly for the Ukraine, as he has been selected as an OSCE election observer. And he will be there on the ground for the May 25th elections, if in fact they even happen at this point with the deteriorating situation. Matthew, as always, thank you. I mean, so many conflicting reports that we're getting. We heard that there was a counteroffensive today here by the Ukrainian military, but is there a sense too little too late?
Yes, I think the Ukrainian government is now facing a crisis of legitimacy. So its attempts to control the situation in eastern and southern Ukraine have failed. It has admitted that as much and said that they do not have the capacity in their security services to contain the Russian advance. I've talked to a friend whose family is from Horlivka, which is one of the towns that was just taken this week. And I asked her what the situation was like on the ground there. And she said, you know, there's a Russian flag flying across the street from our house. And she said, my family is just, they consider themselves under the control of Russia right now. And I said, well, are they pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine? And she said, they're more like apathetic, but they accept the fact that Putin has established control and they just expect that to be the way it is.
We wondered and worried that there would be some signpost moment in here where the violence that was, at least for international consumption, seemingly limited in the beginning, could escalate into something much worse. We're seeing jets shot out of the sky here. Where is it? Where are we on that kind of evolving scale where this goes from a turf battle over the eastern part to something that could evolve into something much worse?
Well, that risk is now non-trivial. I still don't lose a lot of sleep over it because the unconventional war that Putin has been waging inside Ukraine for a while now is actually wildly successful. And so the way the U.S. military describes this is hybrid warfare, which means you have the capability to shoot aircraft out of the sky. There were a couple of helicopters that were shot down just the other day. A couple of Ukrainian crew members were killed. One was taken captive. So you have that going on at the same time that you have, you know, local guys with guns manning checkpoints with a bunch of, you know, tires for a defensive line. And this is all mixed in, right? It's hybridized. It's going well, and so I don't see any point to have Putin move conventional forces into Ukraine yet.
However, we're seeing moments, for example, the CBS News crew that was detained at a checkpoint. Apparently they separated the female reporter and her male counterparts, blindfolded, duct taped, and beat him, and then eventually released him. The idea, at least, was you had professional military that was coming in from Russia wearing civilian clothes here, mixing in, and they were really the drivers of what's going on. It seems that now this is spilling over, and you got rogue thugs here that are part of this, and who knows what the agendas are with them.
It's important to understand that the professional military and the military contractors that we suspect are also in eastern Ukraine on behalf of Russia are not everywhere. And so they are force multipliers. They come in and they take over the building, but then they have to hand it over to someone local, and they move on to other parts of the operation. So it could very well be, as you've suggested, that the CBS reporters who were beaten by local thugs. To me, what that says is that that's a risk point for Putin, because if he doesn't have sufficient control over these local actors, then they could ruin the situation for him. They could force him to do something that would destabilize his strategic aim.
When we ask what happens next, it also begs what can happen next. And there seem to be two options from both the U.S. and NATO, which is we're uncomfortable with what's happening. We don't know where it ends. Militarily, there seems very little, if any, appetite. And then you have the diplomatic side. And today, the president was with Ms. Merkel, and you need the Germans to get on board if any sanctions, significant sanctions, are going to take effect. You saw the back and forth. Is there any substance, or was it just a Rose Garden show of solidarity?
Well, Merkel came out earlier in the week and said outright that Russia overestimates its importance to the German economy. So that was a shot across the bow. But what you're going to see at the end of this next week, I think on May 9th, is that Putin will return from Beijing with an agreement inked with China to sell natural gas there. And that will free him up significantly because he won't be as dependent on the European gas market.
What else happens next? So even if we do drop sanctions and he's less reliant on the Europeans, at what point does it really hurt? Or can we even hurt them in the pocketbook enough to change the course that we're on?
Well, the data we're seeing is mixed. So some reports seem to indicate that there has been a major impact in the short term on the Russian stock market, that there's been a drop in the Moscow index, and this kind of thing. Other reports have said that the sanctions, even the sanctions that the U.S. just put in place this week, the new ones, have had very little effect. The real explanation here is that it's going to take time for these sanctions to have a serious bite. We just don't know how much time.
Nobody really thought or has really banged the table that militarily the U.S., let alone NATO, ought to get involved. Or at least if those voices are, they're not in the main, they're on the margin. But there was an interesting poll that came out that showed the appetite or lack thereof of the American public for it. And I wonder how much you think this played into the Russian perspective of, they can saber rattle all they want over in the States or, over the folks over at the EU. They're not going to do anything. The UN's not going to do anything. Even if they have the wherewithal, they don't have the appetite for it. Is that changing the dynamic here? Because they're at numbers like we've never seen before, where we've said, well, there's enough Iraq, Afghanistan fatigue, no more. Does that play into this too?
Oh, I think absolutely. I think that was a fundamental factor that Putin calculated in when he was, planning this out, probably months ago even, that he understood that the American public had very little appetite for another land war.
You're going over there shortly as an election observer. First off, do you believe where we are now on May 2nd and the election's May 25th, that they're still going to come off?
I think there's a 50-50 chance that they will. I think there's a significant chance that they won't. I think we'll know in the next 2 weeks.
And the chances that if there is an election, that it'll be a legitimate one. I understand your role, as you made it clear to me, is you're not there to interfere. You're just there to observe, as the observers as well. But what's your sense what you're going to find?
The election is going to end up viewed as a legitimate election. The question is going to be whether or not Putin suppresses the vote in eastern and southern Ukraine, and thereby tries to make a claim to invalidate the outcome of that vote by saying, people didn't go to the polls because they don't respect the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government to even hold the election.
You hopeful that this will end at least with some resolution cleanly, or do you think that you and I sit down in a month's time, whether or not there's an election, that this thing has gotten a whole lot bloody and a whole lot messier?
I don't know if it's going to get bloodier or messier. I think there's a serious chance of that. But I don't think it's going to end on May 25th.
You will be an eyewitness to history, and I wish you the best of luck and obviously safe travels there. And we're going to want to have you back when you do come back in one piece. All right?
Absolutely.
Matthew,
Thank you,
you very much. Okay, everyone, remember, we always want you to be involved in our program, so please head over to Facebook and Twitter to sound off on a question today. Should the U.S. get more involved in the Ukraine? Is it our fight? We're going to get to more of that reaction later on. But when we come back, more RFL. Please stay with us.